This psalm is really about the place of Zion and the emphasis that God puts on this place. And it is a. I was thinking about it. I actually had this experience last week. Psalm 102 is not a psalm that I've ever really studied before. You know, it's not a psalm that I've given a lot of attention to in my. Anybody here ever given a lot of attention to Psalm 102 before? Nobody. Isn't that interesting? But it's in the Bible. You know, a couple weeks ago, or last week, I was telling somebody downstairs about what we did in here for Psalm 27 and how I was just so blessed by it. And honestly, I had never really given a lot of thought to Psalm 27 before I presented it here. And I mentioned it, and he said, "Oh, that's like my favorite psalm." Right? And I'm thinking to myself, well, it is now for me too. But it wasn't. And the advantage, the blessing of studying through the Word of God. I mean, of loving His Word. This psalm is a great psalm. Let me, before we'll just read the psalm and then we'll talk about it. 102, a prayer of the afflicted. When he's overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before the Lord. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my trouble. Incline your ear to me. In the day that I call, answer me speedily. You might notice in the Havdalah prayer that he will give us answer quickly, speedily in the day that we ask for it. It's in the Havdalah prayer. It's right here. In the day that I call, answer me speedily. For my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned like a hearth. My heart is stricken and withered like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread. Because of the sound of my groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I'm like a pelican of the wilderness. I'm like an owl of the desert. I lie awake, and I'm like a sparrow alone on the housetop. My enemies reproach me all day long. Those who deride me swear an oath against me. For I have eaten ashes like bread and mingled my drink with weeping, because of your indignation and your wrath. For you have lifted me up and cast me away. My days are like a shadow that lengthens, and I wither away like grass. But you, O Lord, shall endure forever, and the remembrance of your name to all generations. You will arise and have mercy on Zion. For the time to favor her, yes, the set time has come. For your servants take pleasure in her stones, and show favor to her dust. So the nations shall fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth your glory. For the Lord shall build up Zion, and he shall appear in his glory. He shall regard the prayer of the destitute, and shall not despise their prayer. This will be written for the generation to come, that a people not yet to be created may praise the Lord. For he looked down from the height of his sanctuary. From the heaven the Lord viewed the earth, to hear the groaning of the prisoner, to release those appointed to death, to declare the name of the Lord in Zion and his praise in Jerusalem. When the peoples are gathered together and the kingdoms to serve the Lord, he weakened my strength in the way. He shortened my days. I said, "Oh my God, do not take me away in the midst of my days. Your years are throughout all generations. Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak. You will change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. The children of your servants will continue, and their descendants will be established before you." So Sonsino's helpful on this. They usually are. What they say is, The references to the conditions of Zion point to the period of the captivity as well as the time when the psalm was composed. In other words, they're saying this psalm was written during the exile. And in fact, I could find no commentary that did not agree with that. Okay, so it was written while they're in exile. Although Rashi, you can see when he lived, about a millennia later, actually about 1,500 years after the exile, identifies the speaker with Israel. He more probably was an individual captive who details his wretched plight. In other words, he's on the exile, he's part of it, and he's writing about himself. But he pours out his soul as a member of the Israelite community and speaks for the people as well as for himself. One gleam of hope pierces the enveloping darkness, and that is God's eternity, which kindles faith in Zion's restoration. He will not discard his people forever. The day will come for the fulfillment of the promise that Jerusalem shall be the center to which all nations will rally in his service. And as I read that, I thought of how the Passover Seder ends every year. You know, for the last 2,000 years, at the end of a Seder, what do we say? Next year in Jerusalem. Jews have been saying that, right, since 70 AD. And there was no real Jewish country, homeland nation till 1948. For nearly 2,000 years, there has been this belief, we're going to Jerusalem. No other people group prays for the reign of another country the way Jews pray for the reign of Jerusalem, of Israel. You remember the story where in Matthew, I thought of Matthew 6:13, blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you, many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and hear what you hear and did not hear it. Well, he could say that to people who saw him, certainly. And that's much better than what we've seen. But we see something that others have not seen. We see the restoration of this homeland. And there's a very good chance that we're going to be here when the Lord actually comes to this planet. And we will see him. We've seen things that people have prayed for thousands of years. Now the title of this psalm, A Prayer of the Afflicted, when he is overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before the Lord. The word Lord, Yahweh, appears 8 times in the psalm. The psalm offers a prayer, and I'm pointing that out because it'll become significant a little bit later. Okay, so the psalm offers a prayer which others who are near the end of their endurance can echo. When you are near the end of your endurance. The troubles to begin with are private griefs, but later they are transcended by the concern for Zion, whose destiny is glorious, yet painfully slow in coming to fulfillment. So basically the psalm opens like this. I got problems, God. And then he turns to the problems of Israel. And they become his major concern. And that's the bulk, the core of the psalm. And then at the end of the psalm, he goes back to his personal concerns. But that's really the core of the psalm. Yeah, I got problems, and I'm going to tell you about them, and he does, and they're grievous. But then he spends the time talking about Zion before he goes back to himself. And we call it the book of Psalms. In our Jewish Bibles, it's called Tehillim, from the Hebrew word that means, it's actually kind of interesting, because the Hebrew word Tehillim is only found once in the Psalms, in Psalm 145, but a very similar word, Tefillah, appears 32 times, clearly connected. And this is the book of prayer. The whole book of Psalms, you know, is a book of songs. That's what it is. But they're all prayers. And so what do the group of people make songs about their failures and about their pains, right? It's like when Jewish people say that the New Testament is anti-Semitic, no more so than the book of Psalms is. Right? It's our people talking about our messes. Right? Same thing. That's what the book of Psalms is. And so he says, hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come to you. Hear my tefillah. Hear my prayer. And this word here is the same word that you'll find in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the word right there. And you can find this thought throughout the Psalms, not just Psalm 39:12, but there's another one there for you, just because it's throughout the Psalms. And then he says, don't hide your face from me in the day of my trouble. The psalmist is feeling abandoned by God. God seems to be hiding because he has no, it's like you all heard that saying, like when the heavens seem like brass. Like, God, where are you? It's like Job crying out, God, why don't you show up? Because I've got some complaints. That's the prayer of Job. That's what this psalmist is saying. And his first complaint in this psalm is actually clearly then his highest priority, because he sees all the other problems of his life coming out of the fact that God seems absent. If you just showed up, this would not be the way it is. Incline your ear to me. In other words, turn or bow down your ear. No, come down here, God. Show up. That's what he's saying. For my days are consumed like smoke. My bones are burned like a hearth. Like smoke. Literally, Sansino says it this way. It means to be consumed in smoke. As in like extinction. As in like I'm burned out, but I'm burned up. That's what he's saying. And the psalmist will go on now, and he's going to begin to describe his physical problems. He's going to talk about his bones. He's going to talk about his skin or flesh. He's going to talk about what's his burning. Sounds like he's got a fever. He's going to talk about his appetite. He's going to talk about his lack of sleep. And in the ancient culture, actually, bad health was a sign of God's punishment. And in fact, those of us who've been around for a little while will remember that. And I love the Word of Faith movement, but you've all heard the Word of Faith movement criticized for presumably preaching that if you're in a problem, it's because you've sinned. I don't believe that the leaders of that movement actually, or at least the good leaders of that movement actually preach that. But they're criticized for it. And I can remember back in 1988, I was on the board of a church with another person whose wife had written a letter to Kenneth Hagin asking a hard question, like, why did this happen to my family member? And she showed me the letter that Kenneth Hagin had responded with. And he said, the secret, quoting from Deuteronomy 29, the secret things belong to the Lord, but those things that are revealed belong to us. In other words, we don't know, but we preach the word. So I think the people in the Word of Faith, the good preachers, they don't preach that, but they get criticized for it. And it certainly was the belief of the early church, or ancient Israel rather, that if you were dealing with a mess, it was a mess that you caused. But it's clearly, we know better than that. And the Lord is our example. His bones are hurting. There was his body frame. They're burned like bones. They're burned passive. Not he's burning them, but they have been burned. This has happened to him. He's like thrown on a fire in a hearth, a burning mass, and he feels shriveled. He feels scorched by the sun's heat. His emotions are dried up. He feels emotionally famished, if you will. He says, my heart is stricken and withered like grass. I forget to eat my bread. My heart, the heart is lave. It is the understanding or the mind. He just feels like depressed, right? And he says, I forget to eat my bread. It's this loss of appetite. I imagine you all know, I mean, I've never really dealt with depression, but I've been asked by a doctor more than once, how's your appetite? You know why they ask you that question? They want to know if you're depressed, because it's one of the surest signs of depression. And you can just look at me and see I don't have a very big problem. I'm a happy man. He talks about the grass being burned up. The word just means any kind of vegetation. He says, because of the sound of my groaning, my bones cling to my skin. The word for skin, basar, really means flesh. My bones are clinging to my flesh. It's the same thing that we see in Job 19, verse 20. He says, I'm like a pelican of the wilderness, like an owl of the desert. Both of those birds are unclean birds. Not clean birds. It is interesting. You don't find the word pelican, at least in the, I didn't look at all the translations, but the New King James does not have the word pelican in Leviticus 11. It has a word that I've never seen anywhere else, jackdaw. I have no idea what a jackdaw is, but it's a pelican. Okay. What is a pelican? One of the things that I do like about Sonsino, unless they're specifically avoiding, like pushing you away from Yeshua, they'll often quote from Christian commentaries, like they did here. The pelican. They're quoting from a book called The Land and the Book by Thompson, and he says, it was certainly the most somber, austere bird I ever saw. It gave one the blues merely to look at it. I got to admit, I don't think of that way when I think of a pelican. I actually think they're kind of cute. I don't know. What do I know? Maybe I need to check my appetite. But but the psalmist is apparently expressing lonely melancholy, and he talks about wilderness. One thing that I never really caught until I actually looked at it here, the word wilderness, if you look in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, the word wilderness, midbar, and the word mouth are from the same root core word. I need to think about that. The desert and mouth, there's a connection. Add another S. That's how I remember which it is. The desert has one less S. And the owl, the Arabs called the owl the mother of ruins because it lives in desolate places and in derelict buildings. He says, I lie awake. I'm like a sparrow alone on the housetop. In other words, he can't sleep. So whatever the mess is that he's dealing with, it's affecting his sleep. And, a lot of people can't sleep. I had some data that I put in our handout a couple of weeks ago. It's fairly common, especially as people get older. They tend to have harder time sleeping. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the last chapter, alludes to that as well. That becomes the whole last chapter talks about like when you're grinders or are doing things and you're holding on to the banister when you're over something, because when people get older, they tend to have more concern for height and just different things. I was reminded of this yesterday because we had to do something with a dishwasher, and so I got down on the ground, and I'm fairly active. I mean, I work out 6 days a week, but I got to admit, it was like getting down on the ground, getting up off the ground. It's not what it was 40 years ago. It's just not the same. So he says, I lie awake. I'm like a sparrow alone on the housetop. And sparrows are interesting. When one of them has lost its mate, a matter of everyday occurrence, the sparrow will sit on the housetop alone in bereavement. Isn't that interesting? I did not know that. Sparrows do that. He says, my enemies reproach me all day long. Those who deride me swear an oath against me. In other words, they defy me. And it's this PL intensive form. My enemies defy me. My enemies taunt me with intensity. Psalm 42:10, my enemies reproach me, the same word, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? And we all know what it feels like as a person of faith that we're before in front of people who are not of faith, and we're going through a mess. And what kind of testimony am I? Well, I'm in this mess. That's the pain he's feeling right here. Okay. And he says, they deride me. They swear an oath against me. In other words, they're using my name as a curse. But they're saying things like, may you become as wretched as this psalmist. You know, they're using, you can almost take a curse word and put their name in it. That's what he's saying they're doing to me. You know, and he says, I have eaten ashes like bread. I've mingled my drink with weeping. Now, this is figurative poetic language. Obviously, the psalm is full of poetic language. Okay? He's not saying that he's actually eaten ashes. You can just see the word like. It's a simile. A simile is by definition never a statement of fact. By definition. It's a metaphor. If I say he's as tall as a tree, I have not called him a tree. All right? If he said, you called me a tree. No, you're actually lying. I didn't. I did not call you a tree. I said you're as tall as a tree. Right? That's just understand what metaphors are. He's not saying he's eating ashes. What he's saying is my appetite is gone and my food tastes like dirt. Now, that we can probably all relate to. There's been times where food has just not tasted good. And you all remember that like this was a normal part of mourning, like Joshua throwing ashes on his head after he lost the battle at Ai. Okay, so he's mourning. He's saying the word for bread, you know the word bread, lechem. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. That's it right there. And he says, I mingled my drink. My drink is mingled with weeping. In other words, it's like he's got his drink in front of him and he's crying and his tears are going down into his food and he can taste his own tears in his food. That's what he's saying. So he's under a lot of like heavy whatever. He says, because of your indignation and your wrath, God, it's you. You're angry with me. And that's why I'm going through this. God, I'm in the middle of a struggle. And the reason I'm in the struggle is because of you. Now, hopefully we know better than that. Because just because we go through pain does not mean that God's angry with us. Jesus went through pain. God was not angry with him. We go through pain. This is part of life. It's part of the human condition. But the psalmist is struggling with that tension in life. Because of your indignation and your wrath, for you have lifted me up and cast me away. And the picture here is almost like a tornado has lifted him up and thrown him. And his life feels like a storm. And he's like Job, where Job's life feels like a storm. And that's what the psalmist here is saying. And he's been thrown because the psalmist actually seems to be living in exile. Like the stones are going to be mentioned and Zion that's going to be mentioned. He's not even there anymore. And so he's mourning. He's like been cast, thrown to the other side of the planet. He says, but you, O Lord, shall endure forever. Here's where he finds his hope. The mess of my life, but you. But you. And that's the hope. Right there. That's where he goes. I got problems in my bones, and I got problems in my skin, and I got problems with fever, and I got problems with appetite, and I got problems with sleeplessness, but you. That's what he says right there. You will be forever. Olam, from everlasting to everlasting, from olam to olam. But you, I may be very transient, but you. That's the picture. And the remembrance of your name to all generations. Now, it is help. I just think I found it interesting. I'll just say it this way. The word name is the Hebrew word Shem. That's the word. Shem is name. And the word Shem is not actually in the verse, but it's clearly implied. It's implied so much that the translations will usually put it. The TLV won't put the word name here, but it will put the word your renown. TLV says your renown is in verse 12. But what's going to happen is he is going to use this word Shem twice more in the psalm. The actual word Shem. It's only implied here, but it is implied. But the word is going to appear twice more in the psalm. You'll see it in a moment. And in both of those occasions, it's going to be used in a Hebrew poetic parallelism with the word Zion. And here's the big kahuna of the psalm, if you will. The connection of his name and the place of Zion. And this verse here, verse 12 and verse 13, you can see the word name in the New King James, and you'll see the word Zion in verse 13. So even though the word name is not in verse 12, you have that same parallelism. And that parallelism is in all three cases where the New King James English Bible will have the word name. So three times you're going to have this parallelism, this connection between the word name and the place named Zion. They're connected. But you, Yahweh, you are forever. And the memory, the honor, the renownedness of your name is for all generations, not just my generation, not just the generation that's stuck out here in Babylon, but for all generations. And you will arise, and you're going to have mercy on Zion, for the time to favor her. Yes, the set time has come. Now, God lives outside time. From God's perspective, the time has come. The writer of this psalm, he's not living outside time. But what we can get from this verse is there is a time. In Acts chapter 1, Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? It is not for you to know the set days and times that the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power after the Spirit has come upon you. There is clearly a set time, and this psalm is going right there. There is an end to God's discipline upon Zion. That day will end. 1948 was a big day in that step. They're still going through growth pains. Growth pains are a good thing. We're probably all glad we had some. I would like to have had some more. Jeremiah said, "Thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you and cause you to return to this place." There is an end to the discipline upon Zion. Comfort, yes, comfort my people, says your God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem and cry out to her that her warfare is ended, her iniquity is pardoned. She received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. In other words, the discipline has an end. Zion is currently experiencing humiliation in the psalmist's eyes, but that humiliation will come to an end. That is true when the psalmist wrote, and to be frank, it is still true today. Because Zion really is the Temple Mount. And the Temple Mount to this day, an enemy, Ezekiel 36, has said of the Temple, has said of the holy hill, an enemy has said, you have become my possession. So the Temple Mount still has that humiliation, but that day will come to an end as sure as 1948 came. That day will come. It's coming. As one person said, Zion cannot die while Zion's God lives. Zionism is not the product of Abraham's prayer. God put him to sleep and said, I'm going to do this. Zionism is not the product of the quality of the Jewish life. The Jews were not living so well in 1947. Really no better than they were living in 69 AD. God said, my time. And the time of discipline will end, and God will do all that he has ever said he will do. Because every promise he ever spoke to Israel, he spoke from outside the confines of time, knowing everything. Every promise he ever spoke will fully come to pass. The psalmist is reminding God of the ruined state of Zion, hoping to arouse God's compassion on Israel. And although the psalmist is in pain and is praying for relief, his larger concern, larger than his own pain, is his concern for the welfare of Jerusalem and Zion in particular. And as I read that, I'm thinking also of Psalm 137, another psalm that's clearly written from Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. If I forget you, O Jerusalem. These verses are said at every Jewish wedding. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. That's why this psalm is read at Jewish weddings. If I don't remember you on the happiest day of my life, on my wedding, may I lose the ability for my right hand and my tongue. That's what Psalm 137 says. In other words, it's greater than my greatest joy. And what Psalm 102 says is, love for Zion is greater than my greatest pain. Takes just the opposite side. It's that important. For your servants take pleasure in her stones and show favor to her dust. Now that verse right there shows you, it's one of the many bits of evidence within the psalm, that the psalm must be written while Israel is in exile. The servants are taking pleasure in the scattered stones and showing favor to the dust, that all that remains. And it's reminiscent of what happens in Matthew 24 in his eschatological sermon when the Lord said, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And he said, every stone of the Temple Mount's going to be taken apart. And they were historically in 70 AD. And to this day, if you go to Jerusalem on the western wall near the southern corner, you'll see the ruins of all the piles of stones from when the Romans pushed them off of the mountain. They're there today. But you know what? 1948 came. And the day will come when that golden dome will come down. And there will be a temple on that mountain. He says the word name, the Shem is the word for name, in 102 verse 15 is actually used in verse 15. I said it wasn't used in verse 12, it's just implied in verse 12, but it is used in verse 15, and it is used in verse 21. And in both places, there is a parallelism with the word Zion. Okay, so you can see name in verse 15, and if you flip over on the next page, you can see Zion in verse 16. Clearly, there is a poetic parallelism there. And if you go over to verse 21, you can see them both there as well. At the top of that page, to declare the name of the Lord in Zion. There is a connection between the name and the place, between Yahweh's name and the place. That's what he's saying, and that's why I put that little picture there. That picture is a picture of Jerusalem, just a rough topographical picture. And you can see that what looks like a W, but it's the Hebrew letter Shin, which is in the word El Shaddai, God Almighty, and God has his name imprinted in the top topography of the geography of the land. I've got my name on that place. You don't have to remind me, my name's there. Abraham doesn't have to do, I made this covenant. I put him to sleep to make a point. This is my covenant. So Psalm 102 is really emphasizing this connection now between the name of God and the city that has his name on it. His name is embedded in the land through the three valleys. And Zion's eventual full restoration will result in the entire world glorifying the name of God, because God will have demonstrated amazing faithfulness. The Gentiles shall come to your light. The Goyim shall come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your rising. In Psalm 102, verse 15, so the nations shall fear the name. The word for nations there, again, is Goyim. The non-Israelites shall fear the name of Yahweh. The name of the God of Israel will become the name of the God of the world. Also of interesting here, well, God has promised that Zion is going to regain her former glory. The events of 1948 are a tiny step towards what God is going to do. But now this word Shem, name, in verse 15 is actually an allusion also to the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. And you can just literally look at the word Shema and look at the word Shem on the first line. They look the same, the third letter to add it, to turn Shem into Shema. And the psalm opens with this phrase, hear my prayer. And now he's saying, your name is connected to this land. So the psalmist is actually calling for God to hear him in verse 1. And then he's calling for God to hear the prisoners' exiles in verse 20. They're crying out. He'll say, hear their prayers, the exiles, God. And then he looked forward to the day when all the nations, not just Israel, are going to cry out, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is like a really Zionist psalm in the middle of a world that hates Zionism. That's Psalm 102. There's going to be an eschatological gathering, a last days gathering, a pilgrimage of the nations to Zion. It is explicitly mentioned in verse 23. It is only implied here in verse 16. For the Lord shall build up Zion. He shall appear in his glory. He's going to land on Mount Zion. And the Mount of Olives will be split. And he'll walk right into Jerusalem, walk right into Zion. Zechariah 14 tells us about the day when he lands his feet. If I only, for space, didn't give you more verses, but it actually says in Zechariah 14, his feet will set on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the mountain will be split under him. And he shall regard the prayer of the destitute, the word for stripped. You can think about the Lord as he was stripped, as he hung on that cross. He shall regard the prayer, that same word for prayer that opened the psalm. And again, he shall not despise their prayer, the same word for prayer. And this will be written for the generation to come. It's not a generation that exists in their day, and I suggest it's not a generation that exists now either. A generation to come. A people yet to be created, that they may praise the Lord. Now, what is this in Psalm 107:18? This. What is this? What is the this referring to? The this is the gathering of the nations to Zion to worship Israel's God. This, the fact that all the nations of the world are going to gather together in Jerusalem. This is going to be written down and recorded for a future generation. It will become a testimony to the world. Look at what God did and how he was faithful to Israel. That's going to become the testimony of the nations. The Lord's coming. He will do this. The word for generation, the word's door. Many of you will know the phrase, door vidor. From generation to generation, it's repeated, I think it's 9 times, 9 times in the Bible. And there's very close approximations to that, many more times. But this idea of the generation, and this is going to happen. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 28, Paul said, when all things are made subject to him, then the Son himself will also be subject to him, to the Father, who put all things under Yeshua, that God may be all in all. In other words, what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians is the day is going to come when the Lord will have had everything pulled under his feet. And when he does that, he will then hand everything over to the Father. That's going to happen. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 3, I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God. That word tabernacle really looks, I've always believed, that is a clear inference of the Feast of Tabernacles. Who are these people that are yet to be created? I think it's kind of obvious that Passover created a people. Israel. 3 times. Exodus 12 and many other times in Exodus, God refers to Israel as his armies. He created the armies of Israel at the Passover. He created the nation of Israel. He brought them out of Egypt. He made his nation. Passover points to the Son, and he created Israel as a nation. Millions of us. And then Pentecost, Shavuot came. And yes, Israel got her 10 Commandments, her covenant, if you will, okay, but she already had the blood of the lamb in Exodus. But she got a covenant, the 10 Commandments, the preamble to the covenant, if you will, because that's really what the 10 Commandments are, the preamble of Israel's covenant. And they're given at Mount Sinai on Shavuot, which we're counting towards, but they actually occur in Acts 2 when the Spirit writes the commandments on men's hearts. And the church is birthed in Acts 2. So you got the first feast, Passover. You got the second feast, Pentecost. And you have a third feast, because there are 3 big feasts, the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage feasts. A pilgrimage, I'm making my way towards God. A pilgrimage. Passover, the Son, then the Spirit comes. And when they are done working on us, he will have created a people yet to be created. He is creating a people who will be fit to dwell in God's presence. Every day I have thoughts that are completely unworthy of God's presence. Every day. Some days I struggle all day with thoughts that are not worthy of his presence. When God is done creating the people that he is going to create, the whole lot of them will be in his presence, Revelation 21, verse 3. And not one of them will ever have a thought in his presence that is not worthy of his presence. He is creating a people. That's this people yet to be created. Interesting that these are the feasts, the Shalosh Regalim, the pilgrimage feasts, when God calls his people to go to Jerusalem, to go to Zion, to go to the place, and all the nations will glorify the name in the place. And it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations, all the goyim shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, come and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between the goyim, and rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It is kind of interesting that the Hebrew word Yah, in Psalm 102, verse 18, it looks, I made the print. If you look at page 7 on your handout, and look at verse 16, just the way I printed it for you. Look at verse 16. You see the way I put the word Lord? It's not bold. It's blue and it's not bold. There's 8 times you'll see that font. There's only 1 time you're going to see the font for Lord in verse 18. See, it's red, it's bold. See the difference? Okay, all the other 8 times, the word is Yahweh. But in verse 18, it's not Yahweh. In verse 18, it's Yah, which is a shortened form of the word. Yahweh appears 6,519 times in the Hebrew Bible. Yah appears, depending on where you look, 49 or 50 times. It only is used when God is really emphasizing his name. That's the point of the name. We'll rejoice before him and rejoice. Has the psalm go? And rejoice before him by his name, Yah. Remember that song? We used to sing it 30 years ago. That's the point right there. He's saying God is going to create a people who will praise the name of Israel's God. So the names of all other gods are going to be disavowed. And in that day, the God of Israel, the Father, is going to be dwelling in Zion. And nations will stream to Jerusalem to worship the God of Israel. And God is using Israel to create this universal testimony. And this is going to be written down for a people yet to be created. So he looked down from the height of his sanctuary. From the heaven, Yahweh viewed the earth to hear the groaning of the prisoners, the exiles, the captives, the people in Babylon, to release those appointed to death, to declare the name of Yahweh in Zion and his praise in Jerusalem. And when the peoples are gathered together, there's a pilgrimage there, and the kingdoms to serve Yahweh. He weakened my strength in the way. He shortened my days. The psalmist is now reverting to his own personal pain. See, he started there, and then he went to this place of the nation, and now he's coming back to his own personal pain. The pain that he has experienced as a result of what the nation has gone through. We can experience that. The pain that we turn the news on, not too much, because it's a mess. So the psalmist returns to his own personal pain, recognizing that his days are short. He weakened my strength in the way. He shortened my days. My days are short. I hope, he's saying, I hope to live long enough to see the restoration of Zion. We might say, I hope I live long enough to get married. The psalmist says, I hope I live long enough to see Zion restored. That's his heart right there. It is kind of interesting. There is a slight difference. Sometimes, like most of the time when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, especially if the Lord quotes it or if Paul, most of the time it's actually the Septuagint they're quoting. The Greek Bible, not the Hebrew Bible. Septuagint from about 200 BC. They quote both, but the Septuagint's more often quoted. And Psalm 102 is different if you look at it in it's verse 23, really, that is different between the Septuagint, the Greek, and the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Hebrew Masoretic text, they're both really wonderful. They're Bible. He weakened my strength in the way. But the Septuagint says he answered me in the way. And gives this messianic touch to the psalm right there. I'm weak, but the Messiah is coming. And I said, oh my God, do not take me away in the midst of my days. Your years are throughout all generations. In other words, you're forever. Of old you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. In other words, they're just something you did. They will perish. You will endure. We think the stars are eternal. They're not. God is eternal. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak. You'll change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same. And your years will have no end. The children of your servants will continue, and their descendants will be established before you. So the psalmist is pleading for his plea, personally, for his big theology regarding Israel to be realized in his own life. This is what I believe about Israel. God, I'm asking you, make it so in my life. That's essentially the psalm. You said this about Zion, and I am a person of Zion. and I want this to happen in my life. That's what he's saying. I actually have a pretty cool testimony that I could share about this, since we didn't have a testimony. In 2018, Donna had a adrenal tumor. It turned out it was benign. We're very thankful for that. But we didn't know it was going to be benign. So one day, here's how the story goes. Donna had had a blood clot from something, and the doctors did a test on her, and they decided that she had some kind of a genetic condition that required that she needed to be on blood thinners the rest of her life. And so they put her on these blood thinners. And she's on them, and what ends up happening is, out of the blue, one day, she collapses, just collapses. This is 2018, and in the house. And so we go to the doctor, and the doctor does an examination, and he says, well, you have a deflated lung, you have some kind of a tumor on your adrenal gland, and you also have a tumor on your pituitary gland. Now, you know, the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland are both in the endocrine system. So this sounds like an endocrinatic, I'm not sure how to say the word, endocrinatic cancer. More than one endocrine organ, plus a deflated lung. So, like, this sounds really serious. So they're going to do these things, and they're going to give her a biopsy, because it's, you know, she's got cancer, like they want to get right at it. So they're going to do a biopsy. So we start looking for, what do we do? And around the same time, unrelated to this is all true. Around the same time, unrelated to this, my son Michael had taken a DNA test because his wife Natalie had taken a DNA test. Natalie did not know who her father was, and she had been trying to find out her whole life, but for a variety of reasons, her mother was reticent to go down that path with her. And so finally one day, Natalie says, look, Mom, I got to know. And she just pushed the point, and her mom said, okay. So Natalie went and got a DNA test, and it said she was 51% Jewish. She didn't know she was Jewish at all. So that helps her mother figure out who the father, because she didn't really know who the father actually was. Okay, so now she knows who her father is, but she didn't know. Okay, well then around the same, so because she did this DNA test, Mike does the DNA test. The DNA test for him comes back, and it says, I think he was 42%. And I said, Mike, it's not right. He said, well, how do you know? I said, I just know my story. I know I'm 100%, and so I know you're not 42%. And he said, but how do you know? I just know. There's nobody in my family. There's nobody, right? And so, but how do you know? And they just kept pushing. Finally, and then they came back, Ancestry.com came back with a correction. Not 42%, I think it was 47% or 46, something like that. And I said, well, that's closer, but it's still not right. He says, it's not right. How do you know? I know. Well, eventually they gave him another correction. He's 50% Jewish, you know? But that I know. So what happened was, around the same time now, Donna's going through this tumor thing. And so I have really good devotions one morning. I mean, they're really good. You have days like that. I admit most days are not like that. Most days it's just, you know, I'm reading the Bible, you know what I mean? But you have days where it's like God's there. Okay, and it was one of those days. And I happened to be reading about Abraham and the blessing that was on Abraham. And I thought, that's me. I mean, God really touched me. Around the same time, though, Donna's going through this. And at this point, all we know is she's got cancer in more than one endocrine organ and a collapsed lung. I get in the car and I pull out to go to work. I had done the DNA test. The night before, I had done the spit. And and I put it in the mailbox. And I'm pulling out of the driveway, and I'm really feeling like this is like I'm just really feeling all these emotions like that, like the psalmist is describing. And I said, God, you said Abraham was blessed, and I am a child of Abraham, and the proof of it's right there in that mailbox, and this is unacceptable. I actually did say that. And I went off to work. Well, that came back, and it said I was 100%. Okay, but what was really cool was she went to MD Anderson, and they said, first day, they said, okay, you don't have a collapsed lung, just the CAT scan or something must have just caught it at the wrong time. There's nothing wrong with your lungs. Secondly, with regard to the pituitary gland, you definitely don't have that. That's just wrong. And we're not even sure that you have any kind of tumor on your adrenal gland. So we'll go through a bunch of tests, right? It turned out she did have a tumor on her adrenal gland. It was large. It was 206 or 7 grams. The adrenal gland by itself is only 5 or 6 grams. So the tumor was 206 grams, right? It was benign. They usually don't find them. There are no statistics on how often they happen, and there's no survival statistics because basically everybody who gets it dies. And the reason they die is because there's no symptoms until you die. But what happened in her case was they had put her on those blood thinners, and those blood thinners cause you to bleed easier, and tumors cause bleeding, and the two together caused a bleed out on the inside. So that's why she had the collapse. Anyway, long story short, they eventually went in. They did they removed the tumor in one of the 2 adrenal glands. And then during the follow-up, the intern says to the doctor in the room while we're at MD Anderson, the intern says, you know, they did this test on you while you were on a blood thinner to see if you had this, because they had put her on blood thinner. They did this test to see if you needed to be on the blood thinner they did this test to see if you had this genetic issue that would require you be on blood thinner, but they gave you the test while you were on blood thinner. And the result of that is often a bad results. And the doctor heard the intern, he says, that's right. We need to redo this test. And they redid the test, and she does not have the genetic thing, so she does not need to be on blood thinner. She did not need to be on blood thinner. And somebody said to me afterwards, are you mad at the doctors? You're going to sue them for putting on the blood thinner? I said, no, she'd be dead. If she hadn't been on the blood thinner, then she wouldn't have had the bleed out, and she would have died. But she was on the blood thinner. Therefore, she had the bleed out. Therefore, she collapsed. Therefore, we got rid of the tumor. I'm not angry about the blood thinner. I'm actually thankful. This is like one of the best things that's ever happened to us. But when I thought of this psalm, I thought of, because obviously she's not on blood thinner now, but I thought of the way that I grabbed a hold of who I am, and that's what this psalmist did. And I can think of other things that I've seen here at Gateway. I've been here 8 years now. God's hand is on Gateway. I mean, you can't have this happen, what's happened here, right? I've seen people who had extremely successful ministries here and then felt led, felt led to go do something and did. And were blessed, whatever, while they were here, and were very disappointed with what happened when they left. Why? Because of the unique grace here to do something. I have no thought that I would be anywhere near as received if I was not here doing this. When you are part of a people group, Now, God does lead people. He does, absolutely. Absolutely. You need to do exactly what God's called you to do. Absolutely. But when you are part of a people group, you grab a hold of that people group. You're Israel. You grab a hold of that people group and you do it. You do what you're called to. And that's what the psalmist did.